Emily Carter's shift had ended like any other, but something about that morning felt different. The fluorescent lights of the small suburban hospital flickered overhead as she clocked out at precisely 6:12 a.m., rubbing the fatigue from her eyes, her uniform slightly rumpled after 10 hours of back-to-back patients. She was meticulous even when tired, checking her schedule, confirming medication orders, sending a quick message to a colleague about a patient transfer that had arrived unexpectedly in the night. It was the kind of small, professional gesture that had earned her a reputation among staff. Reliable, conscientious, someone who could be counted on when the hospital ran on skeleton crews. Outside, the air was still and faintly cold, a damp, pre-dawn haze settling over the quiet suburban streets. Security cameras would later show her walking calmly across the nearly empty parking lot, her bag slung over one shoulder, keys in hand. There was no sign of panic, no hurried steps, only the quiet rhythm of someone finishing her work and heading home. Neighbors later recalled seeing her car idling near the streetlights, headlights dimmed to avoid blinding any passing vehicle. She had eased it out slowly, merging onto a side street that cut through a row of townhouses and vacant lots. No one followed. No one stopped to wave, to say goodbye, to notice. By the time the first morning deliveries rumbled past the hospital, Emily Carter had vanished. When she didn't return home, her roommate first assumed she had stayed for a few extra minutes at work. But when the hours stretched, messages went unanswered, and calls unreturned, worry began to set in. The hospital, noting her absence for the day shift, filed a missing person report, launching a search that would uncover only the faintest and most unsettling hints of what had happened. Her purse and phone, normally carried everywhere, were left inside her vehicle, almost as if she had intended to return within moments. On the passenger seat lay a pair of reading glasses, a wallet neatly zipped, and her ID badge still clipped to her uniform. A single glove had slipped from her pocket and rested near the door, dusted with the first traces of dew. The faintest smear of blood, just enough to suggest contact but not enough to signal a violent struggle, marked the corner of the car door. Detectives, forensic specialists, and hospital security officers would later note that these small details painted a picture both ordinary and chilling. Emily had left her workplace under control, yet something had interrupted the routine that carried her home each morning. The morning itself held a kind of eerie stillness. Street cleaners began their rounds. Mail carriers passed by. Joggers waved without suspicion, yet none could account for the figure of a young nurse slipping quietly into the neighborhood streets. Friends described her as cautious and prudent, the type who rarely deviated from established patterns, who always informed someone if she planned to linger late or make an unscheduled stop. Even in exhaustion, she was aware of her surroundings. Even in the quiet, she carried the instincts of someone trained to notice danger, someone whose very job demanded vigilance. And yet, that vigilance had seemingly failed her that morning, leaving her absence to echo across town like an unanswered question. Within hours, police cars arrived, lights flashing silently in the pre-dawn gray. Investigators combed the hospital grounds, scanning cameras for overlooked angles, retracing Emily's steps across hallways and parking lots, talking to the janitorial staff who had begun cleanup, questioning security personnel who remembered her crossing the lot just moments before she disappeared. Outside, neighbors described what they thought they had seen. A car slowly moving toward the side street, a figure briefly visible through the mist, and then nothing. No trace, no sound, no explanation. The scene felt ordinary on the surface, yet the missing elements, the phone, the purse, the ID left behind, hinted at a story unfolding invisibly, a thread that only a careful observer could begin to follow. Family members arrived soon after the initial reports. Her mother's eyes were wide, uncomprehending, scanning the parking lot, the street, the nearby sidewalks, as though the very act of looking could make Emily appear. Her father's jaw tightened. He demanded answers that no one could provide, questioning neighbors, colleagues, and officers alike. Her younger sister called repeatedly, hoping against reason that Emily had simply overslept, had stopped to grab a coffee, had left a note somewhere that would resolve the worry with an ordinary explanation. But each attempt at rationalization began to crumble against the mounting strangeness of the scene. Small evidence inconsistent with the story of a nurse going home, or staying at work, or simply losing track of time, Detectives scoured the hospital's internal security systems, replaying footage frame by frame. They noticed the subtle detail of the glove, how it fell from her hand almost imperceptibly as she crossed the asphalt. They paused on the faint mark of red on her car door, tracing it with digital enhancements, attempting to determine whether it was blood from Emily herself or from another source. Outside, officers spoke to delivery drivers who had passed the side street, to the occasional jogger, to residents walking dogs in the early morning mist. Each account provided a fragment, a brushstroke of movement that only emphasized what was missing: the absence of Emily herself, the impossibility of a trail, the sense that she had simply ceased to exist in the space where she had just been. By mid-morning, search patterns expanded beyond the hospital. Officers began canvassing surrounding neighborhoods, walking alleyways and parking lots, lifting fallen leaves and inspecting empty lots for tire tracks or footprints. Volunteers joined from the local community, eager to help but untrained, their energy tempered by confusion as the hours passed without result. Small signs of disturbance, broken branches, scuffed dirt, a faint imprint in soft soil were documented, catalogued, and ultimately found to lead nowhere conclusive. The feeling of normality clashed violently with the reality: Emily Carter was missing, not misplaced, not late, not distracted, but entirely absent. By afternoon, the investigation had shifted from a routine check-in to a formal search and rescue. Detectives spoke to colleagues who had worked the night shift, reviewing patient charts, medical logs, and internal communications. Nurses recalled her concern over the late transfer, the meticulous notes she had left, her habit of double-checking every detail before leaving. None could imagine her voluntarily abandoning the careful structure she adhered to, yet nothing in the evidence suggested she had been coerced. Security footage remained frustratingly incomplete, and officers noted minor anomalies, camera angles obscured by poles, brief flickers of missing frames that hinted at the unseen possibilities of what might have happened in the quiet streets that morning. As the sun rose higher, painting the empty streets with washed-out light, a sense of urgency settled over both the town and Emily's family. Phone calls to missing persons hotlines went out, social media alerts were sent, and detectives began canvassing larger areas, tracing not only the hospital but every conceivable route she might have taken. Yet the narrative remained maddeningly incomplete. There was no abduction witnessed, no vehicle sightings confirmed, no physical evidence suggesting a violent confrontation. Only fragments: a glove, a smear, a set of keys, a meticulously organized purse, and the haunting silence of someone who had vanished while the town still slept. By evening, Emily's absence had transformed the community's perception of safety. What had begun as a typical morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood had become a tangible reminder of vulnerability. The streets seemed emptier, the parking lots more ominous, as neighbors questioned how a single person could disappear without leaving any reliable trace. Family members struggled to maintain composure, holding tightly to the hope that Emily might still be found, even as detectives admitted privately that the lack of evidence complicated every possible theory. They could rule nothing out, yet prove nothing. And in that tension, the story of Emily Carter's last night remained suspended between reality and speculation, a mystery anchored by ordinary details that concealed extraordinary absence. And so the night closed on her first vanished day. A responsible adult, conscientious, beloved, and ordinary in all visible ways, had stepped out into a world she knew and never returned. The parking lot stood silent, the side streets deserted, the early morning haze settling over scattered debris that would become critical markers for investigators in the weeks to come. What happened to Emily Carter that morning would not reveal itself in hours or days. It would take time, attention, and chance to uncover even a fraction of the truth, leaving family, friends, and investigators suspended in fear, grief, and relentless uncertainty. By the time the sun rose fully over the quiet suburban streets, Emily Carter's absence had evolved from a personal worry into a community concern. Police cruisers patrolled the area in grid patterns, their tires crunching over the thin layer of morning frost, while volunteers spread out across alleys, sidewalks, and the fringes of small wooded patches behind nearby homes. K-9 units padded silently beside handlers, noses to the ground, ears twitching for any scent of the missing nurse. Yet the dogs, trained to follow a trail even under difficult conditions, faltered quickly. Their attention would flare, a brief glimmer of promise, then fizzle into confusion, unable to find a continuous path to follow. Within hours, the trail went cold, leaving search teams with nothing more than Emily's last recorded steps and the faint sense that she had disappeared into a void. Security cameras captured her leaving the hospital and walking calmly toward her car, her movements deliberate and unhurried. But once she entered the vehicle, she vanished from all recorded life. Every nearby camera, at convenience stores, traffic intersections, and even the neighborhood's few private homes, showed either nothing or static. One streetlight camera, directly overlooking the side street she had chosen, later proved almost perversely unhelpful. Its footage, which could have traced her movements with clarity, only recorded a handful of frozen frames, blanked intermittently by a technical glitch. Investigators puzzled over it, reviewing angles, wiring, and timing, but nothing explained the lapse. The images left only fragments of information. Her vehicle positioned in a darkened lane, a silhouette in a frozen split second, and then silence. Emily's car itself became an enigma. Parked under a streetlight a block away, it remained locked for hours. The engine was cold, as if it had never been used that morning, contradicting the sparse eyewitness accounts of neighbors. Around mid-morning, a resident reported hearing a car door slam in the distance, sharp and jarring, but impossible to place in context. Hours had passed since Emily was last seen. The sound seemed detached from reality, an auditory hint that someone or something had been near the vehicle long after it should have been abandoned. These inconsistencies gnawed at investigators. Every logical explanation, routine errands, accidental lock-in, even voluntary disappearance, crumbled under scrutiny. The silence around her movements grew heavier with each passing hour. Authorities extended their inquiry beyond the immediate neighborhood. Hospitals were contacted to check for any emergency admissions. Clinics and pharmacies were asked to review recent visits, and local law enforcement scoured jail and public transportation records for signs of Emily. None existed. There was no ticket, no report, no accidental check-in. Even online activity that might indicate voluntary absence was non-existent. Her social media accounts remained active only in the scheduled, automated posts, untouched by human interaction. Each lead that might offer closure or direction failed to produce a result, leaving investigators staring at an invisible trail, as though the person they sought had evaporated into the fabric of the town itself. Tips began to pour in from neighbors, co-workers, and casual passers-by. Each account added layers of noise and confusion rather than clarity. One resident claimed to have seen a woman matching Emily's description walking down a deserted street near dawn. Another insisted she had spotted a figure slipping into a delivery van on the opposite side of town. Every tip carried a sense of urgency and emotional weight, but none could withstand investigation. Security footage contradicted witnesses. Alibis did not align. Sightings were either misremembered or outright fabrications. In some cases, individuals admitted they wanted attention or felt compelled to insert themselves into the narrative, hoping for recognition or to assist, yet only further muddied the truth. The search teams began to sift through layers of anecdotal evidence, distinguishing between the credible and the impossible, yet even the smallest kernel of certainty remained elusive. Inside Emily's home, the tension was suffocating. Her mother paced from room to room, checking her calendar, her phone, the positions of small items that had been touched 1,000 times before. Each unanswered call, each message sent into the void, reinforced a growing certainty that Emily's disappearance was not voluntary. She insisted that her daughter would never abandon her life, her job, and her responsibilities without explanation. Yet the evidence offered no reassurance. Her father, by contrast, wrestled with darker possibilities. He speculated about someone watching her, following her, lying in wait along the familiar routes she traveled daily. The image of a predator operating in the shadows of an ordinary suburban morning was terrifying, but in the absence of any clear evidence, it became a dominant narrative in his mind. Family arguments escalated, emotions frayed, and the quiet tension that had defined their household for years gave way to raw fear and uncertainty. As the investigation broadened, the town itself became a character in the unfolding drama. Neighbors exchanged whispered stories at early morning mail pickups, sharing recollections of someone moving unusually fast through a lot, or a car parked where it shouldn't be, or a fleeting glance through misty streetlights. Each anecdote was weighed against others, cataloged in police reports, yet most dissolved into contradiction. Detectives juggled public pressure, the need to validate leads, and the ethical weight of pursuing tips that might ultimately prove irrelevant. Every conflicting story strained their focus, leaving them to navigate the impossible balance between diligent inquiry and the haunting sense that Emily had left no trail for anyone to follow. The search's psychological impact on investigators was palpable. K-9 units returned with exhausted dogs, handlers struggling to mask the frustration. Patrol officers spoke quietly in vans, comparing notes, replaying camera footage, and mentally tracing routes that had led nowhere. They reviewed basic assumptions. Emily might have walked, someone might have taken her, she could have left voluntarily, but each theory ran into contradictions. The absence of a struggle suggested calm, yet the abandoned car suggested otherwise. The lack of any confirmed sightings suggested disappearance, yet the scattered auditory clues: the distant car door, the shuffled footsteps, a faint thump against a dumpster hinted at unseen presence. For the first time, many officers realized they were dealing with a situation that might defy conventional understanding, where the rules of routine searches offered little guidance. Hours turned to evening, and still, Emily's trail remained empty. Streetlights flickered on across the neighborhood, casting long shadows on roads that had once felt familiar and safe. Volunteers returned to their homes, exhausted and emotionally drained, leaving behind maps marked with potential sightings, colored pins denoting tips that led nowhere, and the faint echo of a young woman who had vanished without a sound. Investigators documented every anomaly, noting the locked car, the cold engine, the glove, the faint blood smear, and the missing phone, cataloging the scene with methodical precision, even as the larger pattern eluded them. By nightfall, the emptiness itself had become a symbol. Emily Carter, meticulous, cautious, and deeply responsible, had disappeared into a space that neither neighbors nor professionals could define. The tension between hope and despair tightened around her family like a vice, and within the investigating team, a quiet resignation began to creep, in the realization that the first day might only be the beginning of a long, agonizing search through partial clues, unreliable reports, and unseen forces. Yet, beneath the frustration, a fragile thread of optimism remained. Somewhere, somehow, the truth of her disappearance existed, waiting for the patient, relentless efforts of those unwilling to let her vanish entirely from the world she had inhabited just hours before. The narrative of Emily Carter's empty trail closed on a haunting ambiguity. Nothing conclusive could yet be stated, but the fragments hinted at larger forces at work, an unrecorded path, a presence unseen, a timeline punctuated by anomalies that refused easy explanation. Her family, desperate and fractured, would cling to hope. Investigators, weary but determined, would continue the painstaking process of tracing each shadow, each whisper, each unconfirmed tip. And for the audience witnessing these early hours, the story planted the seed of unease, that a young nurse could disappear in broad daylight, leaving behind nothing but silence, confusion, and an invisible trail that would haunt a town for years to come. In the months following Emily Carter's disappearance, the quiet suburban town that had once seemed ordinary became a place of whispered theories and unrelenting curiosity. At first, neighbors and coworkers struggled to make sense of the sudden void she left behind. A young, meticulous nurse, admired for her precision and calm under pressure, had vanished without a trace in broad daylight, leaving her car abandoned, her phone and purse behind, and an entire community grasping for answers. What began as immediate concern soon transformed into a prolonged obsession, a collective attempt to impose order on chaos. Within weeks, online forums and local community boards were alive with speculation. Posts ranged from the practical searching for sightings or overlooked evidence to the fantastical, weaving elaborate scenarios about stalking, kidnapping, or deliberate escape. The town, previously tight-knit, fractured along these lines, with residents choosing sides between believers in foul play and those clinging to rational explanations. Law enforcement remained engaged, though constrained by the slow trickle of evidence. Detectives revisited the original reports, scrutinized the security footage, and maintained lists of potential witnesses. Tips continued to arrive daily, some credible at first glance, others quickly dismissed. One man claimed he had seen a woman matching Emily's description in a neighboring state, purchasing groceries under a name he could not recall. The investigation team traced his account, checking credit card records and cross-referencing license plate numbers, only to find no connection. Another hiker reported footprints near a popular park trail, unusually fresh despite the winter frost. Search parties returned to the location repeatedly, yet the footprints led nowhere, vanishing into soft soil or giving way to other travelers' marks. A janitor at a distant hospital insisted Emily had checked in under a different identity, claiming she had seemed anxious and in a hurry. Hospital administration confirmed no such admission, dismissing the account as a misremembered routine. Each lead, no matter how compelling at first, dissolved under scrutiny, leaving investigators with the gnawing frustration of repeated dead ends. Meanwhile, the family endured a relentless emotional toll. Emily's parents faced not only the private anguish of uncertainty but also the invasive scrutiny of neighbors and acquaintances. Strangers whispered about hidden motives or alleged family secrets, projecting their own fears and suspicions onto those left behind. Close friends, trying to process their grief and confusion, occasionally questioned details of Emily's life they had once assumed were ordinary, wondering whether they had missed signs of distress or danger. The mother, a quiet woman of measured temperament, began to obsess over every small detail: a slightly misplaced document, a forgotten phone call, or a minor discrepancy in the hospital schedule. Each small anomaly was a reminder that the truth might still be out there, waiting to be uncovered. Her father, more overtly frustrated, struggled to contain his anger and helplessness. He questioned both himself and others, struggling with the possibility that someone had deliberately taken Emily, or that the family's understanding of her life was incomplete. Tensions within the household deepened as hope and despair fluctuated like unsteady weather. The investigators, aware of the delicate emotional landscape surrounding the case, worked with a meticulous balance of professionalism and empathy. Every tip was logged and tracked, no matter how improbable, while efforts were made to protect the family from public speculation. Psychologists consulted on the case noted the unique strain placed on families of missing adults. Unlike deaths, where grief is definitive, or injuries, where recovery is possible, disappearances exist in a suspended state of emotional limbo. Family members live with constant vigilance, a heightened awareness that their loved one could appear or be found in any circumstance. Each day brings a psychological burden of waiting, rechecking, and interpreting small signals, a tension that can last for years, or even decades. Emily's parents became case studies in this quiet torment, their daily routines punctuated by revisiting old leads, monitoring public boards, and preparing for the possibility that another tip might finally break the case open. As years passed, the narrative around Emily's disappearance expanded beyond the immediate vicinity of her home. Local journalists occasionally revisited the story, reminding the public of her unresolved fate, which kept attention flickering back to the small town. Online, forums buzzed with speculation. Some threads insisted Emily had fled to start a new life, while others leaned toward a sinister explanation: an abduction by someone who knew her patterns, who had carefully observed her and chosen the perfect opportunity. More elaborate theories emerged, weaving in historical cases of disappearances in similar suburban neighborhoods, suggesting patterns and connections that authorities had long dismissed. Despite the volume of theories, none produced actionable evidence. Investigators, accustomed to the pressure from public attention, maintained a disciplined approach. All leads were considered, documented, and filed, but each was carefully tested against what was known of Emily's life and habits. The town's physical landscape subtly reinforced the passage of time and the lingering absence of Emily. Streets she once walked became faintly haunted. The side street where neighbors reported her car slowly moving in the early morning remained unchanged, yet seemed smaller, quieter, almost waiting. Parks and wooded areas were revisited multiple times, each trip underscoring the difficulty of retracing her final movements. Security footage from businesses along her likely route was re-examined repeatedly. Each frame was scrutinized for a hint of movement, an overlooked pedestrian, a vehicle that might not have belonged, yet all remained frustratingly inconclusive. Even the hospital, the central location of her last known moments, became a symbol of unresolved tension. Staff who had seen her last adjusted their routines, sometimes glancing toward the exits as if expecting to see her return, haunted by the impossibility of reconciling her disappearance with the orderliness of her life. Over the course of these 8 years, the emotional stakes for Emily's family deepened. Each rumor, each fleeting sighting, acted as a pulse of hope and fear. Days of silence alternated with bursts of anxious investigation whenever a new lead emerged. Her mother would carefully record every tip in a notebook, cataloging dates, locations, and descriptions, seeking patterns that might reveal a breakthrough. Her father, unable to contain frustration, occasionally confronted law enforcement, demanding progress, yet ultimately returning to the quiet despair of uncertainty. Siblings, friends, and colleagues all experienced the same pendulum of hope and hopelessness, each narrative thread adding to the tension and the enduring sense that Emily's life and the events of that morning were suspended in time, unresolved and impossible to predict. The repeated dead ends began to carve a unique pattern in the community's collective memory. Residents learned that every claimed sighting had to be tempered by caution. Every rumor demanded verification. The emotional toll was subtle but pervasive. Anxiety threaded through conversations, a quiet reluctance to walk alone at night, and a cautious distance taken by some toward the hospital and side streets tied to Emily's disappearance. Yet these years also demonstrated the persistence of hope. Friends continued to leave notes at familiar locations. Online communities maintained discussion threads, and investigators returned repeatedly to the evidence, unwilling to allow any lead, no matter how small, to remain unexplored. Psychologists who studied the family noted a key dynamic. Unresolved disappearances create a unique form of grief that defies conventional closure. There is no finality in the traditional sense, only layers of expectation, suspicion, and tentative optimism. Every day, Emily's family negotiated the tension between the imagined possibilities of her safety and the grim likelihood of harm, a psychological balancing act that shaped their behaviors, decisions, and interactions with each other. Investigators, aware of this emotional landscape, navigated interviews, public statements, and tip management with care, yet the burden of an 8-year investigation began to weigh heavily on even the most seasoned officers. As the years stretched on, the story of Emily Carter's disappearance became more than a case file. It transformed into a living, evolving narrative, one that gripped the town, its institutions, and the online communities that followed it with obsessive attention. Every minor clue, every abandoned lead, and every unconfirmed sighting contributed to a growing mythology that both helped and hindered the search. Community theories ranged from accidental disappearance in a local park, voluntary disappearance, to more ominous explanations involving potential predators or foul play. The cumulative effect was both profound and maddening. Emily's presence was felt everywhere and nowhere, her absence defined by the intensity of the speculation that surrounded it. By the end of this 8-year period, the stage was set for revelation. The family remained vigilant, investigators prepared for breakthroughs, and the public, though weary, still followed the case with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. While no single clue had yet offered resolution, the long chain of speculation, dead ends, and fragmented reports ensured that Emily's disappearance would remain a haunting presence, demanding eventual answers. The story's tension, carefully nurtured over nearly a decade, primed the world for the discovery that would finally break the silence, challenging everything assumed about what happened that morning and setting the narrative on a collision course with truth. 8 years had passed since Emily Carter vanished into the quiet suburban morning, and in that time, the absence of answers had settled over the community like an unyielding fog. Her family had lived in a suspended state, the weight of unresolved grief pressing against each day. Neighbors had long ceased walking the side streets where she was last seen, and investigators had filed her case under cold, keeping only a cautious watch for new evidence. Yet in the shadow of that quiet resignation, an unexpected break would surface. Not from a law enforcement breakthrough, but from a solitary hiker whose morning routine would uncover the first tangible clue in nearly a decade. It was a crisp autumn day, the air carrying the sharp scent of fallen leaves and distant smoke from a wood-burning stove. A recreational hiker, following a trail that skirted the back of an abandoned warehouse on the town's fringe, noticed a subtle anomaly in the ground. What first appeared to be a depression in the soil soon revealed itself as a partially buried duffel bag, wedged between decayed pallets and overgrown shrubs. The bag's canvas, frayed and dust-covered, suggested it had been there for years, overlooked by countless passers-by. When the hiker called the sheriff's office, deputies responded quickly, their approach cautious and methodical, aware of the potential significance of such a discovery in a case long thought to be stalled. The excavation of the duffel bag was meticulous. Deputies donned gloves and used small brushes and trowels to avoid damaging the contents. When the bag was finally lifted free, it revealed a startling tableau of personal artifacts frozen in time. A nurse's uniform, with Emily Carter's embroidered name tag, neatly folded, its fabric stiff with age, a set of personal belongings, including a wallet with a partially faded ID and a compact mirror, and a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The journal's entries ended abruptly on the day of her disappearance, the final words unfinished, suggesting interruption or sudden departure. Forensic teams immediately collected the items, treating each as evidence, and transported them to the lab for detailed analysis. Initial forensic results were both confirming and perplexing. DNA testing confirmed the belongings belonged to Emily, as expected, but trace fibers and hair not belonging to her or anyone in her close circle were discovered within the lining of the bag and interwoven with the uniform. The fibers suggested the presence of another individual, someone who had had direct contact with the items, raising the possibility of foul play. The isolated nature of the location, tucked behind the warehouse and overgrown with vegetation, explained why the bag had remained hidden for so long, and investigators immediately began to consider that it may have been deliberately concealed. This was no random deposition. It was a choice, a silent act designed to delay discovery, and the implications sent a ripple of shock through both the investigative team and the community at large. News of the discovery traveled quickly. Local media outlets, which had long relegated Emily's case to brief cold case mentions, now returned to the story with renewed intensity. Television crews and journalists revisited the neighborhood, interviewing neighbors who had not spoken publicly in years and collecting fresh statements from anyone who might have noticed unusual activity around the warehouse during the period of Emily's disappearance. Community response was immediate, a mixture of relief, hope, and deepening fear. Residents who had long speculated about voluntary disappearance or misadventure now confronted the unsettling possibility that Emily's disappearance might have involved intentional harm. Public meetings were convened, and the town's collective consciousness shifted from frustrated speculation to heightened vigilance. With the renewed attention, investigators revisited overlooked digital evidence. Security footage from businesses along nearby streets, previously dismissed as inconclusive, was scrutinized with the knowledge that the duffel bag's location was intentional. Analysts identified potential vehicles passing the area during the time window when Emily vanished, noting that a delivery truck, originally ignored, may have been present along the warehouse perimeter. Witness statements were re-interviewed, with subtle inconsistencies now gaining significance in light of the discovery. Residents recalled seeing strangers loitering near the warehouse, odd deliveries at unusual hours, and unfamiliar vehicles parked for brief periods. Each previously dismissed detail now became a potential puzzle piece in a larger, darker narrative. The impact on Emily's family was profound and immediate. Her mother, who had spent years clinging to the hope of a safe return, felt both vindicated and devastated. The discovery proved her daughter had not simply vanished voluntarily. Something more sinister had occurred. Her father, long oscillating between suspicion and despair, now channeled his energy into working with investigators, providing access to old records, phone logs, and personal artifacts that might illuminate the gaps between her last known movements and the location of the duffel bag. Siblings and close friends, who had endured years of rumors and speculation, experienced an emotional rush, akin to seeing a long-suppressed truth surface. The family's grief, long tempered by uncertainty, now deepened with the stark recognition that Emily's disappearance had been the result of deliberate concealment. Investigators approached the next phase with careful urgency. Each item from the bag was catalogued and analyzed in minute detail. The uniform, for instance, bore faint smudges that forensic teams believed could be environmental in origin, perhaps from contact with soil or dust in the warehouse area, or potentially transferred from another individual. The journal, which had been so intimately tied to Emily's daily routines, became a key artifact. Handwriting analysis, chemical tests on the ink, and microscopic examination of the page edges suggested it had been handled by another person after her disappearance. Such findings, while subtle, were critical in reconstructing the timeline and establishing the presence of an unknown actor. The discovery also prompted a broader review of the town's environmental and structural records. Investigators revisited building permits, delivery schedules, and warehouse activity logs, hoping to identify anyone with access to the area during the relevant time period. Local historians and longtime residents provided oral histories about the warehouse, recalling past uses and occupants, revealing patterns of human activity that might have facilitated the concealment of items. Even small details, a missing padlock, a faded delivery receipt, or an unrecorded maintenance visit, suddenly assumed significance, and detectives began to piece together a series of events that suggested the duffel bag's placement was intentional, premeditated, and calculated. Public perception of the case shifted dramatically. Forums that had long been filled with speculation and conjecture became spaces for cautious optimism and renewed investigative collaboration. Citizens began submitting old photographs, recollections, and personal observations, hoping to fill gaps or assist in reconstructing events from nearly a decade prior. Social media threads that had previously fueled wild theories now engaged in collaborative review, with amateur sleuths and professional investigators alike scrutinizing every detail of the duffel bag discovery. For the first time in 8 years, a sense of actionable momentum returned to the case. Even within law enforcement, the discovery transformed the dynamics of the investigation. Cold case units, who had previously balanced Emily's file among dozens of unresolved cases, now prioritized her case for deeper forensic analysis. Multi-agency cooperation was initiated. Evidence was shared with state and federal forensic labs. Specialized teams reviewed trace materials, and crime scene reconstruction experts simulated potential scenarios based on the bag's location and contents. Each analysis, each simulation, aimed to move the case from a narrative of uncertainty into a framework of testable hypotheses. The duffel bag, its contents, and the forensic anomalies became the central pivot point around which the investigation now rotated. The long years of speculation, dead ends, and public rumor suddenly gave way to concrete questions. Who had handled the bag, and when? How had Emily's belongings come to rest in such a deliberately concealed location? Did the unknown fibers indicate a single individual or multiple actors? Each new question carried the weight of urgency and hope, and the investigators' growing conviction that answers were finally within reach reshaped the trajectory of the case. As the town absorbed the revelation, the narrative surrounding Emily Carter's disappearance transformed from one of endless conjecture to a focused inquiry into human actions and motives. The discovery of the bag underscored a fundamental truth. She had not disappeared by accident, nor had she fled voluntarily. Her absence had been orchestrated, concealed, and maintained across years, leaving a family and a community grasping for clarity in the wake of deliberate deceit. For the first time, the story was no longer only about loss, it was about the possibility of uncovering truth, no matter how long it had been hidden. This breakthrough would set the stage for a deeper investigation into the circumstances of Emily's disappearance, providing law enforcement and forensic teams with a tangible starting point for unraveling the events of that fateful day. While the full story remained shrouded in shadows, the duffel bag's emergence marked the first significant crack in the wall of uncertainty, promising that the answers long sought might finally be within reach, and that the quiet suburban streets that had once swallowed her existence could soon reveal the truth behind her vanishing. Once the duffel bag, journal, and uniform were secured, forensic teams began a painstaking examination that would transform speculation into tangible evidence. Every item was treated as a silent witness, each crease and fiber carefully documented under high-resolution microscopes and chemical analyzers. The uniform, once a simple symbol of Emily Carter's professional identity, revealed subtle anomalies, fibers embedded in the lining that did not belong to her clothing or her immediate environment, strands of fabric indicating prolonged contact with a second individual. DNA analysis, while limited due to degradation, confirmed the presence of a foreign profile, suggesting a close physical encounter, the kind consistent with a struggle or forced handling. This evidence instantly reframed the narrative. What had once been considered a possible voluntary disappearance or accidental misadventure now bore the unmistakable markers of human interference. Investigators turned to the journal, a delicate artifact whose pages had survived years of neglect, yet preserved an intimate record of Emily's final thoughts. Her handwriting was meticulous, yet the entries betrayed an escalating unease. She had documented incidents at the hospital that now seemed alarmingly relevant. Visitors who lingered too long with certain patients, co-workers whose behavior blurred professional boundaries, and small but persistent signs of surveillance or attention that unsettled her. One entry, written just days before her disappearance, noted a co-worker who had made inappropriate advances and a patient whose visitors seemed to monitor her movements, shadowing her steps across the ward. The context of these passages, initially dismissed as ordinary workplace frustrations, took on a sinister dimension when aligned with the physical evidence. It became clear that Emily had sensed danger, and her written words were a subtle warning of the environment she navigated daily. Cross-referencing these journal entries with hospital HR and security reports revealed patterns previously overlooked. Reports of unauthorized access to certain floors, incomplete visitor logs, and misplaced surveillance footage now became significant. A security officer recalled a man seen repeatedly near the parking lot during late-night shifts, dismissed at the time as a maintenance worker. HR records indicated that one employee had been subject to complaints for boundary violations, yet nothing had escalated due to lack of corroboration. These historical records, once fragments of bureaucratic noise, suddenly framed a web of potential suspects and situational pressures. Investigators recognized that someone within Emily's professional sphere may have been observing, tracking, and manipulating circumstances, creating an opportunity for her disappearance to occur unnoticed. Technological re-examination of surveillance footage marked a pivotal breakthrough. Using modern enhancement software unavailable at the time of the original investigation, analysts were able to clarify shadows and blurry frames, revealing a figure following Emily's car on multiple occasions in the weeks leading to her disappearance. The person remained at a distance, careful not to be directly captured, but consistent movement patterns suggested deliberate surveillance rather than coincidence. The integration of these recordings with vehicle registration logs, local traffic cameras, and witness statements narrowed the potential pool of observers and indicated premeditation. Emily had been targeted over time, her routines noted and exploited by someone familiar enough with her habits to anticipate her path home. Investigators combined these findings with geographic profiling to reconstruct the probable timeline of her final movements. Emily left the hospital at her usual time, following her routine route, unaware of the shadow she carried behind her. It appeared that she was intercepted before reaching her typical turn onto the main road. The path to the warehouse, a secluded location known to few residents, was not random. Detectives theorized that she had been guided, either coaxed or forced, toward this remote site where the duffel bag would eventually be found. Witness accounts of a vehicle idling near the back of the abandoned building weeks prior, previously dismissed as a transient anomaly, now suggested prearranged positioning, a preparatory stage for an encounter that would culminate in her disappearance. The forensic reconstruction extended beyond physical artifacts. Analysts considered timing, environmental conditions, and human behavior, integrating patterns into a cohesive scenario. The fibers, DNA traces, and surveillance data suggested direct contact and confrontation, while the journal entries provided psychological context, revealing Emily's growing awareness of potential threats. Investigators concluded that she had likely been intercepted intentionally, her movements monitored and manipulated by someone familiar with both her routines and the surrounding geography. The sequence was methodical: observe, isolate, intercept, and relocate to the hidden warehouse area, where concealment could be maintained indefinitely. The realization that her disappearance was calculated, not random, added layers of gravity to the case, intensifying both investigative urgency and emotional resonance for her family. Forensic teams also scrutinized the duffel bag's placement itself. Soil samples, pollen analysis, and microtrace evidence indicated that the bag had been stored in conditions consistent with long-term concealment. The location, tucked behind pallets and overgrown brush, was deliberately chosen to evade discovery. Any passers-by would be unlikely to notice it, and even if spotted, the bag's unassuming appearance did not suggest critical significance. This understanding reinforced the theory that Emily's disappearance was the result of deliberate action rather than misfortune, an intentional effort to obscure evidence and delay resolution. The realization that every detail, the bag's positioning, the timing of the interception, and the prior surveillance was intentional, underscored the calculated nature of the crime. The emotional weight of these findings resonated deeply with Emily's family. Her parents, who had endured years of uncertainty, confronted a new reality. Their daughter's disappearance was not merely a tragic mystery, but a crime with human agency behind it. The knowledge that someone had watched, planned, and executed actions leading to her vanishing intensified grief, yet also provided clarity. They began to comprehend the scope of what had happened, connecting the dots between Emily's final observations, the forensic evidence, and the timeline of her disappearance. This understanding, while painful, allowed for a shift from indefinite speculation to a focused pursuit of justice, marking a critical emotional transition for the family. With evidence increasingly pointing to calculated intent, investigators widened their search for suspects, revisiting prior leads that had seemed inconclusive. The shadowy figure captured in surveillance footage, the foreign fibers and DNA, and the behavioral patterns identified from Emily's journal created a composite profile, a person familiar with her schedule, capable of planning concealment, and willing to engage in coercive or confrontational acts. Interviews with former coworkers, local residents, and delivery personnel provided contextual depth, with subtle recollections, brief glances, strange vehicle movements, and unexplained observations coalescing into a coherent pattern when aligned with forensic timelines. Each element added texture to the scenario, reinforcing the conclusion that her disappearance had been orchestrated by someone who understood both her habits and the local geography intimately. As forensic reconstruction continued, the emotional stakes remained high. The public, long accustomed to cold case updates and rumor-driven speculation, now witnessed a methodical unraveling of events that combined science, behavioral analysis, and human testimony. The story shifted from abstract worry to tangible urgency. Emily had been intercepted, her final movements traceable, her disappearance linked to identifiable patterns and behaviors. For investigators, the case had evolved from a passive search into an active reconstruction, a forensic puzzle in which every fiber, every entry, and every shadowed frame contributed to a growing understanding of what had transpired. By the conclusion of this phase, it was clear that Emily's disappearance was not a simple accident, nor a flight from responsibility or life pressures. It was a targeted act, the culmination of observation, premeditation, and opportunity exploited by someone within her environment. The forensic reconstruction transformed intangible speculation into actionable insight, mapping the psychological and physical trajectory of her final hours. Detectives were now equipped to advance toward the final phase, identifying the individual or individuals responsible, understanding their motives, and bridging the gap between discovery and resolution. The culmination of forensic analysis left both the investigative team and Emily's family with a sobering truth. Her absence had been orchestrated with deliberate care, her routines exploited, and her fate manipulated to remain hidden for years. Yet this clarity, grim as it was, also carried the potential for resolution. The combined power of modern forensics, behavioral profiling, and investigative persistence had transformed the narrative from an unsolvable mystery into a structured path toward answers. In that moment, the silence of the preceding 8 years fractured, replaced by the quiet but resolute pulse of a case moving toward the light of understanding, setting the stage for the ultimate revelation of what had happened to Emily Carter. For nearly 8 years, the disappearance of Emily Carter had haunted her family, friends, and community. Each lead, tip, or rumor that surfaced seemed to raise more questions than answers, and the very absence of evidence became the defining feature of the case. Yet, beneath the surface of cold leads and dead ends, investigators had been quietly piecing together a pattern, assembling fragments of surveillance footage, forensic traces, and witness accounts into a coherent narrative. The breakthrough came when cross-referencing personnel records, criminal history databases, and prior security logs revealed a shadowy figure who had moved within Emily's orbit at precisely the right or wrong moments to exploit her routines. He was a former security contractor at the hospital, someone whose official role ostensibly ensured safety, but whose personal history suggested a capacity for predatory behavior. Minor criminal offenses, harassment complaints, and a series of boundary violations painted a portrait of someone who had, over time, observed and assessed the vulnerabilities of those around him, gradually escalating his actions in a way that would culminate in tragedy. Investigators reconstructed his involvement with painstaking care. Emily's nightly departures from the hospital, documented through security footage, were consistent and predictable, a rhythm he had studied for weeks. Surveillance enhancement revealed him approaching her vehicle under the pretense of routine maintenance, a behavior so innocuous that at the time it would not have triggered alarm. It was the perfect cover for observation. No one suspected an intent beyond duty, and yet it positioned him to execute his plan with methodical precision. The combination of opportunity, familiarity with the hospital's layout, and an intimate knowledge of Emily's routines created a scenario in which she could be intercepted without immediate detection. The sequence of events that night unfolded with grim clarity when investigators combined forensic evidence with behavioral analysis. Emily left her shift at dawn, exhausted but vigilant, following her usual route to the nearly empty parking lot. The security contractor, previously seen nearby in subtle surveillance, intercepted her under the guise of a maintenance check. It is likely he initially engaged her with conversation, leveraging his professional authority to lower her guard. Once isolated and coerced, she was placed into his vehicle and transported to a secluded warehouse area, chosen deliberately for its inaccessibility and distance from the public eye. Forensic traces, including fibers embedded in her uniform, minor DNA markers, and disturbances in her personal items, confirmed a struggle had occurred, brief but forceful, consistent with someone resisting an abduction, yet unable to overpower a determined and prepared assailant. At the warehouse, the deliberate concealment of her personal effects was executed with precision. The duffel bag discovered by the hiker 8 years later had been partially buried behind pallets and debris, its contents including her nurse's uniform, journal, and personal belongings arranged methodically to ensure delayed discovery. Investigators noted the arrangement suggested awareness of forensic principles, items placed carefully to prevent immediate detection, the uniform folded with care, the journal shielded from exposure. The location was remote enough that casual discovery would have been unlikely for years, and yet it remained accessible to anyone who might happen upon it by chance, as indeed happened. Every action demonstrated forethought, an understanding of investigative limitations, and an intent to control the narrative of Emily's disappearance, shaping both perception and evidence in a calculated manner. Modern forensic techniques enabled investigators to reconstruct the confrontation and subsequent concealment in remarkable detail. Trace fibers from a second person's clothing indicated physical contact, while minor blood traces and disruption of clothing fibers suggested a brief struggle. The spatial positioning of items within the duffel bag and the condition of the journal allowed analysts to infer the sequence in which personal effects were removed, arranged, and hidden. Each element aligned with the broader timeline. Emily's routine departure from the hospital, her interception, transport to the warehouse, and the deliberate staging of her belongings. Investigators could now narrate not only where Emily had been, but also how her disappearance was executed with chilling efficiency, exposing the methodical nature of the crime rather than leaving it to speculation or conjecture. The psychological dimension of the case was equally significant. Emily's assailant had exploited both situational and environmental vulnerabilities, the predictability of her commute, the isolation of certain streets, and the inattention of those around her. His prior record suggested a pattern of escalating violations. Minor offenses and complaints had gradually built into the opportunity for a serious crime. Behavioral experts consulted by investigators emphasized the predatory logic evident in his planning, noting how familiarity, observation, and incremental boundary testing created a context in which a single action could have irreversible consequences. It was the culmination of months of surveillance and preparation, not a spontaneous act of violence. The absence of eyewitness testimony had long hindered the case. Shortly after Emily's disappearance, the suspect died in an unrelated accident, leaving no living individual to corroborate the reconstructed events. This tragic coincidence had contributed to the 8-year limbo that defined the family's grief. Yet forensic evidence, modern analytical techniques, and investigative persistence compensated for the lack of direct witnesses. Every recovered item, every DNA trace, and every fiber became a critical piece of the puzzle, confirming the pattern of coercion and concealment and providing a coherent account that could be relied upon to understand the case definitively. With the reconstruction complete, the focus shifted to closure. Emily's family, having endured nearly a decade of uncertainty and grief, were invited to visit the warehouse site to recover her belongings. For them, the experience was both sobering and profoundly emotional. Her journal, worn but legible, offered insight into her thoughts, anxieties, and the daily life that had been so abruptly disrupted. Her uniform, preserved by the careful concealment and the passage of time, was tangible evidence of her existence, of her identity, and of the events that had transpired. Each item returned to the family served as a bridge between years of unresolved pain and the final recognition of truth. The hiker's accidental discovery underscored the role of chance in cold cases. Had it not been for an unintentional encounter with the buried duffel bag, Emily's fate might have remained unresolved, leaving questions unanswered and grief unmitigated. Investigators reflected on this interplay of timing, opportunity, and accidental discovery, acknowledging that the resolution of such cases often depends not solely on diligence, but also on the fragile coincidences that bring hidden truths to light. It was a stark reminder of how many cases remain unresolved, simply due to the absence of fortuitous circumstances, and of how rare it is for chance and perseverance to converge in a way that brings clarity. As the family engaged with the recovered materials, a palpable sense of catharsis began to emerge. Years of anxiety, speculation, and fear were now replaced with a grounded understanding of what had happened. They could finally comprehend the calculated nature of the abduction, the deliberate concealment, and the absence of witnesses due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The combination of forensic clarity and tangible evidence allowed them to grieve with understanding, rather than in ambiguity, a rare and vital distinction for families of missing persons. For the investigators, the case became a testament to both persistence and methodical reconstruction. Each step of the process, from the initial analysis of fibers and DNA to the integration of surveillance footage and behavioral profiling, demonstrated the layered, painstaking work necessary to illuminate a case long hidden in shadows. Their acknowledgement of the serendipity that led to discovery did not diminish the rigor of their work, but rather highlighted the complex interplay between human diligence and the unpredictable elements of circumstance. The conclusion of the case validated the painstaking efforts of all involved and illustrated the profound impact that modern forensic science can have when combined with patient, systematic investigation. The narrative of Emily Carter's disappearance, once defined by ambiguity and speculation, was now grounded in documented events and verifiable actions. The story revealed the stark realities of premeditated crime, the vulnerabilities inherent in predictable routines, and the enduring human consequences of unresolved disappearances. Her family, now in possession of her personal effects and journal, could honor her memory with tangible evidence, transforming years of abstract loss into a narrative that was both complete and comprehensible. The emotional closure provided a measure of peace, allowing them to reconcile the pain of loss with the reality of truth, however painful that truth might be. In reflecting on the case, investigators emphasize the delicate balance between opportunity and chance in cold cases. Emily's disappearance demonstrated how deliberate action could remain hidden for years when combined with environmental isolation and careful manipulation of evidence, and conversely, how unplanned events, the hiker's discovery, seasonal changes exposing the duffel bag, could abruptly illuminate what had been hidden. The case became emblematic of the fragility of unresolved mysteries and the importance of perseverance, forensic evolution, and meticulous reconstruction in the pursuit of justice and closure. Ultimately, the story concluded with both emotional and investigative resolution. Emily's family could finally reconcile the absence of answers with the presence of truth. Investigators could close the case with confidence in the sequence of events. The public narrative, long dominated by speculation, rumor, and uncertainty, was replaced with a definitive account grounded in evidence and human understanding. The final scene, family and authorities together at the warehouse, carefully recovering the journal, uniform, and personal effects, offered a poignant, emotionally resonant conclusion. It underscored the human cost of disappearance, the power of investigative rigor, and the unexpected role of chance in revealing hidden truths. In the silence that followed the recovery, there was recognition of the immense complexity and emotional weight of the story. The painstaking efforts of investigators, the passage of 8 years, and the accidental discovery had converged to deliver justice in the form of truth, if not in the form of accountability for the perpetrator. Emily Carter's story, once an unresolved enigma, was now a complete narrative, a case of deliberate abduction, careful concealment, and ultimate revelation. The resolution provided a rare and powerful example of closure for the families of missing persons and the broader community, illustrating the interplay between human diligence, investigative science, and the fragile contingencies of chance that can bring hidden stories into the light. As the family departed the warehouse site, carrying Emily's journal and personal effects, the weight of years of uncertainty seemed to lift slightly, replaced by an understanding of events that had remained obscured for nearly a decade. While grief remained, it was now tempered by knowledge, by acknowledgement of the truth, and by the ability to honor Emily's life through awareness and remembrance. Investigators quietly acknowledged that without the accidental discovery, the painstaking reconstruction, and the convergence of small, fortuitous circumstances, Emily's fate might have remained sealed in obscurity forever. The story, at last, delivered both resolution and emotional catharsis, leaving viewers and family alike with the gravity of long-term loss, but also a profound sense of truth finally revealed.